Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, I would like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors patron family. Please visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Join the Talking Tudors patron family to instantly unlock access to exclusive posts, including audio releases and videos. Patrons are also eligible to attend additional monthly live talks and to enter patron-only monthly giveaways. August's prize is a gift pack from the recent exhibition, The Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England, kindly sponsored by Dr. Valerie Schutte. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that Leah Redmond Chang is joining me on the podcast to chat about her new book, Young Queens: 3 Renaissance Women and the Price of Power. Leah Redmond Chang is a former Associate Professor of French Literature and Culture at the George Washington University. Her writing draws on her extensive experience as a researcher in the archives and in rare book libraries. Her previous books include Into Print, The Invention of Female Authorship in Early Modern France, which focused on women and book culture in the 16th century, and, with Catherine Kong, Portraits of the Queen Mother, about the many public faces of Catherine de Medici. She lives with her husband and 3 children and divides her time between Washington, D.C. and London. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Leah. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes, I've been so looking forward to talking to you after listening to your fantastic book. Loved every second of it. So it's so lovely to be here with you.
Well, I'm really excited for this conversation.
Now, Leah, I think we should start with you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about you and your background.
Sure. Well, I'm Leah Redmond Chang, and I wrote a book called Young Queens: 3 Renaissance Women and the Price of Power. And I come to history through a kind of winding path. I was always interested in history, and for many years thought about going to history for graduate school, to history programs, but instead I ended up in literature. Partially because I thought that in literature I'd be able to do both history and literature together, which was both true and not true. But I never really forgot my love of history. And in many ways, even as I was studying literature, I was always trying to talk about the past in a kind of multidimensional way. And so I was a professor for many years, but now I'm writing full time. And this book really, in some ways, kind of marries my love of both history and literature.
Wonderful. And so the book is actually about 3 incredible women. So Catherine de Medici, Mary Queen of Scots, and Catherine's daughter, Elisabeth de Valois. So why did you decide to write about these 3 women in particular?
Well, I had done a project on Catherine de Medici involving a lot of sort of deep thinking about Catherine and why she has the reputation that she has and how she got there. And in doing that project, I was introduced to Elisabeth. And I say introduced because I really didn't know much about Elisabeth, even though I had studied the Renaissance for so long. And that was really surprising to me. So when I was done with this project, I decided, well, first of all, I didn't have Catherine out of my blood. I wanted to do a little bit more about her, but I also really wanted to know more about Elisabeth. And so I went looking for her, and what I found fascinated me because she was so young and because she has sort of fallen out of cultural memory. And the fact that she's sort of forgotten was itself interesting to me. And then as I was researching Catherine and Elisabeth, I realized by looking at some of the documents from the 16th century just how important Mary Queen of Scots was to their lives, and the fact that they were all together for many years at the French court. So they're kind of a family unit. Catherine is French queen consort, Elisabeth de Valois is her daughter, and Mary Queen of Scots is her daughter-in-law, and also Elisabeth de Valois' very close childhood friend. So that was a natural unit. And at the same time, it was sort of incredible that for a very brief period of time, all of them are queens and all of them are living together. And then I also realized that one way or another, all of them face very similar challenges that have everything to do with being young and female. So both because chronologically it made sense and thematically it made sense, I decided to tackle all three.
And I'm so glad you did. I have to say, I think if I have to choose a favorite part of your book, which is very difficult because I loved everything, it was learning more about Elisabeth. Now, I've been immersed in this world for a long time as well. And I feel like Mary Queen of Scots, yes, and Catherine de Medici, of course, because of her relationship with Elisabeth is quite well known. But I was fascinated to learn about Elisabeth, and you've actually inspired me to do a little more digging. So thank you, Leah. That's really wonderful. So tell us a little bit about how women in power were viewed during this period.
Well, I think it's not a surprise to anybody that they're not viewed particularly well. But I do want to say that there are different kinds of power, right, in the 16th century. And so there's a lot of, power behind the scenes that women wield. Certainly, women were often in many ways the, leaders of their families. I'm thinking of the Guises in particular, how important women were to that family. Then you have female regents, of course, who, exerted different degrees of power. So I feel like there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes power that women would wield and that was condoned. But then you have inevitably those moments, particularly in the 16th century, when women are very visibly on the throne or very visibly right beside it, like Catherine was. And that is not viewed too favorably. It seems to make everybody anxious. There's something, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. There's something, there's like a fine line. A queen consort is so necessary to this dynastic world, right? That is the Renaissance. But as soon as she steps beyond that role of the consort, and becomes the reigning sovereign, it's like the whole system gets shaken up and no one really knows quite what to do. And everyone's just really wishing for that man to come back in and take over.
It's so true. I feel like they viewed it as sort of an unnatural thing, and anything that they saw as unnatural obviously made them quite nervous and anxious. So going back to Catherine de Medici, why do you think it is that she has such a bad reputation? I still see people calling her all sorts of things today online.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think that it starts in the 16th century. And in some ways, it's a hard question to answer because there are so many hundreds of years separating us from Catherine, and things have really changed along the way. I think that, first of all, her bad reputation starts in the 16th century because she's an easy scapegoat. She's not born in France, even though she has a French mother. She's born in Italy. Her father's family, these are the Medici. And they're commoners. It doesn't matter how wealthy they are, how powerful they are commoners. And even though Catherine's mother is a French princess, she kind of inherits this commoner status. And when things go wrong, it's very easy for the French to point at that. So that's one reason. And also she reigns at a time that is so polarized, right? That she has enemies. And just like the times we live in now, it's always the extremes that have the loudest voices. And so the people who hated Catherine were very, very loud, even though there were many people who loved Catherine in the 16th century too. And then, I do think that there is something about hating women that resonates across time periods and becomes very easy to build narratives off of. So lots of 17th century propaganda, or even propaganda in England in the late 16th century under Elizabeth Tudor. And then even into the 17th century in multiple countries start to use this narrative of the evil Italian queen because it's easy and it kind of resonates with people. And I think that we're still kind of fascinated with this idea of the evil Machiavellian woman. And so even though so many scholars have actually tried to work to undo this narrative of Catherine and show a far more complex, interesting leader, it's kind of an easier soundbite to talk about the evil Italian queen. And so it endures.
Yeah, and it makes good television, obviously, because that's what we've seen on television, haven't we? Yeah, you're absolutely right. Reputation at this point was everything, wasn't it? It was a woman's protection, especially a woman in power like Catherine. So she becomes very vulnerable once people start attacking that. So I'm so glad that you've done so much to rehabilitate her in your book as well. But I'd love to know a little bit more about the woman that you actually discovered during your research. Researching and writing about a person, you become quite close to them, don't you? So what did you think of her?
Oh, so I'm a fan of Catherine. I will say that I really am. Elisabeth de Valois, in many ways, was the inspiration for this book because I really wanted to bring her forward, but I also wanted to work against this terrible reputation, this kind of flattened reputation that Catherine has. I did want to show a much more complex person. And you really do see that in reading her letters, partially because I started with her as a child to the extent that I can. I tried to go back, as young as I could with each of these women. And Catherine had such a terrible childhood in many ways, such a vulnerable and terrifying childhood. And it's hard not to sympathize with the child who is a political pawn really from the time she's born, but certainly from the time she's about 8 years old. And she's an orphan and she has very little obvious family support. And when I tried to empathize with that figure, it just became much easier to see where Catherine might be coming from. First as a child and then as a young woman, how that childhood informed her experience as a young woman, how the experience as a young woman informed who she became as a woman and as a queen consort and then a queen mother. I also, really just sat with those letters. I had done this project on Catherine before that involved a lot of translation. And so when you're translating letters, you are really spending a lot of time in their heads. And Catherine, she was such a doting mom. And there's a way in which we can kind of see that as helicopterish and controlling. And I think she was in many ways, but we can also see that as coming from a place of desire, of just really needing her children in some ways to survive and to thrive. Partially because, as you know, she was barren for 10 years before she has children. So having children is so meaningful for her. And also because she herself had this tumultuous childhood. So it was probably very important for her to kind of give her children an idyllic childhood. And then because she naturally loved them. She's a woman who seemed to really love her children and be quite involved to the extent that she can in their lives. And plus, motherhood for anybody at this time is a harrowing experience because children so often fall ill and die.
Yeah, there were so many heartbreaking moments in her story, really heartbreaking moments. So who were you most drawn to when you were actually writing? I'm sort of hearing that you love Catherine, but you were really quite drawn to Elisabeth as well. Is there one that you would say you kind of felt an affinity with more?
Okay, so people ask me this question, and I don't know if it's cheating to say, "Oh, I love all three." It does feel like I'm giving the easy answer, but I will stand by that answer, and I'll try to explain a little bit. I did really, really love Catherine, partially because I was allowed to do so. I mean, she has so many letters, so many more than Elisabeth de Valois, for instance, and even Mary Queen of Scots, right? So many letters. She was so prolific. So I really could just be in her head a lot more. So in that way, it was sort of easier to empathize. But with all three, I was trying to capture a kind of psychological portrait. And so I did come to relate to all of them in different ways. So with Elisabeth, I think Elisabeth really drove home to me just how young all of these girls were when they were expected to, leave home and then take on these sort of politically significant roles. And just as sort of this young girl who kind of represents the experience of so many young girls, whether they are royal or aristocratic, I really felt, Elisabeth that way. And then she just wants so badly to please her mom. I think that we can all relate to that in some ways. You see this very human kind of mother-daughter relationship develop between the two of them. So I really felt like I was lucky to see that through Elisabeth. And then with Mary, Queen of Scots, something else happened. So Mary is so everywhere, right? Like we all know her story. Most of us have been reading about her since we were young children ourselves. We think we know her. And that's the thing, right? We think we know her. And then when I had to get into those letters and sort of recontextualize Mary, in France in relation to her little childhood friend, Elisabeth, or her mother-in-law who used to like her and then comes to not like her, I started to see a different side of Mary, a Mary who was kind of lost, and a Mary who just wants to be where she was in childhood again. I feel like maybe, I don't know if everyone can identify with that, but there are those times in your life where, you're kind of undergoing a transition or something has really changed, or you're growing into adulthood and you have to assume these roles that, just aren't comfortable anymore. And you kind of get nostalgic about your childhood, right? And how easy it used to be. You see it through rose-colored glasses.
Yeah.
I felt like I saw a lot of that in Mary, this sort of idealizing of her childhood in France and just wanting to get back there again. And I felt so bad for her. And I hadn't really seen that in Mary before working on this book.
Let's stay with Mary, Queen of Scots for the moment. What do you think is one of the most pervasive misconceptions about her? She's also one that hasn't done very well in terms of reputation throughout the centuries. So what's something that really stood out to you?
That is a great question. I'm going to answer it, and then probably in like an hour, I will have, wished I would have answered it differently. So there's this excellent biography of Mary, Queen of Scots, which I love, by Jenny Wormold, right? And it's, Mary, Queen of Scots as a failure, the reluctant ruler. And I will say that really informed my understanding of Mary. But what I would say is, I think that if Mary was a failed ruler or a reluctant ruler, she was almost raised to fail. Something about the way that, the Guises raised her, or the context in which she was raised in the French court, it's almost like this was all stacked against her from the beginning, because she's raised to be the superstar, this glittering future queen consort in France, and she does it so well, right? I mean, she is the it girl in France. She thrives in that system, and no one seems to have thought that maybe she was going to need a whole other set of skills if she was going to rule Scotland. And, why is that? That is something that I can't quite answer fully. Is it because they always thought, and by they, I mean the Guises and Mary herself and everybody else, did they always think that she was going to get married and a husband was going to do this for her? I think that they really did, because that's what all the women did, right? Like Elisabeth Tudor, the shocking thing is that she doesn't get married, right? That's kind of what everyone thinks is going to happen. And I think that Mary is raised to be this wonderful potential wife, right? Because that's her best shot at ruling Scotland well, is being a great wife. And then suddenly she gets back to Scotland. She doesn't have the skill, and no one really wants to marry her, at least not the kind of person that she wants to get married to. And in some ways, that was also the fault of the Guises and her childhood, because they've raised her to be so arrogant, so confident in her own pedigree, that she lacks the ability to kind of realize that she needs to, make a shift. She needs to turn things around and maybe do something a little bit different if she's going to survive. She's not able to do that. So to some degree, I think that Mary is often blamed for her bad choices. But I kind of wonder if she never had any choice but to make those bad choices, because she was simply following, the path that had been laid out for her from the time she was a child.
Now, that's such a wonderful answer. I I did a lot of reflecting as well while reading your book about Mary, and you know, you often hear this being sort of thrown around that she put her trust in men that basically didn't merit it and all that sort of thing. And I was just thinking about her and Elisabeth, obviously different stories, but there are similarities there as well. And why Elisabeth managed to have such a successful rule supported by so many men, whereas Mary was kind of, you know, I don't know, not never really taken seriously, is the sense that I got. Did you sort of think about any of those things while you were writing?
Well, yeah, yes, because to be honest, like Elizabeth Tudor had a much bigger role in the first draft of the book.
Right. Okay.
Yes. And then everyone was, sort of fighting for space. And so I eventually had to demote Elizabeth. But, well, first of all, Elizabeth Tudor had Mary Tudor. She had 5 years, right, to kind of think about what worked and what didn't work. And she was a little bit older, by the time she, takes the crown. And the difference, if you think about it in your own life, between 18 and 26 or 25 is pretty big. And Elisabeth, like Catherine de Medici, and I should clarify, Elizabeth Tudor, like Catherine de Medici, she has had to fight since she was a child, right? These are women who are trained from childhood to become survivors, because it would have been very easy to be kind of trammeled for them. Each of their, circumstances were quite disadvantageous. Whereas Mary is coddled in her youth. She's not really given the chance to develop a certain form of grit. So I think that she kind of relies on the tools that worked for her as a queen consort, right? Like being flirtatious and being beautiful and having fun with her friends. Plus, she's 18 when she first gets back to Scotland. She kind of just wants to have fun. And she hasn't really developed a very savvy political mind the way that Elizabeth Tudor is forced to quite young.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic points. So in terms of parallels between life for women in the 16th century and now, did you find many of those?
Well, yes, on a kind of overarching thematic way. So, obviously I'm American. I live in the States. We are undergoing quite a large discussion of the politicizing of women's bodies these days. And I feel like Young Queens in many ways is all about the politicizing of women's bodies and how women's bodies have been politicized for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, entire political systems are built around the question of women's fertility or infertility, right? So to some degree, I feel like, it's just that the nature of the question has shifted a little, but we're still dealing with the same fundamental idea that on some level, women's bodies are kind of the backbone of our political systems.
Yeah. And do you still think that there's a sense that women in power still make people nervous? Do you still feel that kind of...
Yes. Women, I think that, there's still this effort to kind of categorize them and to flatten them, to sort of, make them seem like these stereotypes. Why that is, I don't know. Maybe it's because it makes people nervous. Maybe it's because it's such an available trope in order to dismiss your political adversary, right? Like you go for the easiest thing. And the easiest thing is that these leaders are women. But, I was thinking, for instance, when Angela Merkel resigned, when she left, there was a piece talking about, her very modest lifestyle. And I think she says something to the effect, or something in the reporting of this piece made me realize how that very modest lifestyle had been cultivated quite expressly by Merkel for years, right? Specifically to avoid, being pounced upon as a female leader. So to some degree, like every ounce of the life, every ounce of the public image does have to be managed in a certain way in order for women in power to avoid these very common and easy stereotypes. So they can just do their jobs.
Yeah, exactly. Just as the women in the 16th century. Incredible. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the research process, because I just loved how this book was written, how you wrote this book.
Sure. Okay. So this is where I think, my background as an academic does come in, I think. I mean, I was really trained as an academic, and that means, sitting with the primary sources, always. I use a lot of secondary sources because you have to, and also because secondary sources are so necessary to give you your bearings in the archive, even to know what to look at, but also how to approach these things, and also to kind of give you a sense of how maybe you want to approach things differently. So, but really like sitting with those primary sources is so important, and looking at every detail. I think my literature background comes in a little bit here. I mean, historians are trained this way too, but as a literature scholar, I was really trained as a close reader, which means, kind of looking at really small things like the placement of a comma or the choice of a word, and pulling a lot of meaning, a lot of larger meaning out of these small things. And so I think having that approach helped me think about things like Elisabeth de Valois' period, which seems like a very small thing, very specific to this one girl's life, but that actually has such huge political importance, such huge meaning. So sort of making those connections between the very small and the very large was quite important to me. And then the other thing is that in terms of the writing, is that I love narrative nonfiction. I love creative nonfiction. You see a lot of it, particularly around modern topics. I've always thought that, the more that we can do of that kind of narrative storytelling for, historically distant topics, the more we will get people interested in this stuff. So, I wanted to be quite literary about it. I wanted it to be very character driven, really get into the minds of these queens so that we see them as people. And that's why it reads the way it does.
Yeah, I think you've done that so successfully, because I did feel like I knew all three women by the end and actually really missed them when your book was over. So thank you for that. I also just have one final question for you before we do the other sort of fun stuff that we've got to do. And that is just, what is your sort of ultimate hope for this book? When you were writing it, what were you really wanting people to get from it or to learn from it?
Well, I didn't use this word in the book, so I'm going to use it now. I think what we're looking at is a version of the patriarchy. That's what these women are negotiating. And so I wanted people to come away with an idea of, in the 16th century, the patriarchy looks a certain way, and this is how it shapes these women's lives. And these are how women deal with it. This is how they negotiate their way. This is how they survive within this system. And I think I also sort of, another big takeaway is to think of these historical figures as people. It's so easy to kind of see them as, I guess, sort of figures in these larger phenomena, whether it be, wars or movements, but not really, kind of understand their emotional complexity. And I know for myself, like, that's when I get very, very attached to something historical, is when I have an emotional connection. So I hope that readers can make that emotional connection, because they will feel and they will see the links that we still have to the past, even if we're talking about people and events that occurred 500 years ago.
I certainly made that emotional connection, and I encourage everyone who is listening to read Young Queens. It is absolutely brilliant. And Leah, are you working on something new at the moment that you can tell us about? Or
it's a little bit of a secret, but mostly because I'm still not sure. Okay. So I don't want to reveal too much, because anything could change. But post-colon of this book is 3 Renaissance women and the price of power, and I'm always interested in that relationship between women and power, how women wield power, but how also power gets enacted on them. So I think that the next project will have something to do with that as well.
Oh, fantastic. I'm excited. I can't wait. We're going to do our little 10 to go now. So these are 10 questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So you've told us that you live in the United States, but what's something that you love about your particular area, wherever you are?
Well, right now it's summer. And in DC, I'm in Washington, DC, and it's hot. And the cicadas, these insects, they just make this noise. And for many years, I lived in the UK, and I hadn't realized how much I miss the cicadas. So right now, the cicadas are singing.
Well,
and I just
come to
love
Australia,
it.
you'll hear them as well. So you'd be right at home.
Then I'll love it. I'll love it there too.
Yeah, they are the music of summer, aren't they? That's how I think of them, definitely. And what about a new skill that you would like to learn?
Okay, I think I want to learn to play pickleball. I can't
Pickleball.
believe.
What's pickleball? I don't know pickleball.
Oh my gosh, it has taken off in the US. It is so popular now that people are even complaining about it because people are playing pickleball at all hours of the night and the early morning. It's like a version of tennis. And I'm almost embarrassed to say it because it's sort of associated with old people, but now everyone is playing pickleball. And I kind of feel like I'm having pickleball FOMO, right? Like if I don't learn to play, I'll be completely left out.
There you go. I have to Google pickleball after this and see what I'm missing out on. So, what about the last book that you read or that you're currently reading?
Let's see. I just finished a wonderful nonfiction book called Beyond the Shores by Tamara J. Walker about Black Americans who decide to travel abroad and sort of come to terms with the racial experience. This is particularly in the early 20th century, but actually throughout the 20th century, sort of come to terms with the racial experience in the US by their travels abroad. It's excellent. It's wonderful.
And what do you like to do to relax and unwind?
I bake.
Yeah.
It's so trite, but I do. I bake bread, I bake focaccia, I bake too many cookies, and then I eat them.
That sounds perfect. I love it. Do you have any pets?
I do. I have a dog. I have a dog named Bonnie. She's an Aussie Labradoodle, and she is smart as a whip, except for I was just complaining today because she refuses to play fetch. She just will not do it.
Clever dog. There you go. And if you enjoy traveling, and I know you've done a bit of traveling lately for your book, what's a favorite travel destination, holiday destination for you?
Well, I always love going back to London. I lived there for several years. When I go back, it does still feel like home to me. So I love that. I love that I can travel to another country and find a place that feels like home. But the other place that I just went back to recently, but hadn't been to in so many years is Hawaii, which is also very meaningful to me because my father's from there. But I hadn't been in years, and when I went back again, another place that in so many ways feels like home. So it was great to rediscover it again.
Oh, I love Hawaii. It's absolutely beautiful. And what about the last film or series show that you watched?
Okay. Well, so right now, on the advice of an Instagram, correspondent, I started watching Lost in Austin.
Oh, yes. I've heard good things about
Yes,
that.
yes. I've gotten through the first two episodes, and it is really cute. It is totally absorbing. It's definitely like candy. I mean, if you love Jane Austen, and who doesn't really, I absolutely love it. It's just so clever. It's really well done. So it's very light, but complete pleasure.
Yeah, well, I think you need that after what you've been immersed in for a little while. So, what about, Leah, a favorite season and why?
Well, I would always say autumn because that's when my birthday is. But so I am in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Los Angeles where we don't really have a change of seasons in the same way. And so, when I moved to DC, that was one of the delights is just the change in seasons. And when we get to the fall, the leaves are changing, and then, we can all pull out our wonderful coats and we can curl up with a good cup of tea and a book and make something delicious and just have all those smells. So in some ways, I think it's very multi-sensory.
Oh, I love autumn too. That would have to be my
Yeah.
favorite as well. So, I haven't asked this one in a while. What was one of your favorite childhood toys?
So it was not Barbie.
Not Barbie.
No, let's see. I did not play with toys. I read. I really did. I read just a lot.
Or maybe a
I
favorite
read,
childhood book then might be a better one for you.
yes. So I don't know. I think this is mostly popular in the States, but I do think it has some international reach. I was absolutely in love with the Little House series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I think that actually this does relate to sort of what I've written. That book, that series of books is fiction, but it reads like nonfiction. I thought for the longest time that it was truly a biography, and now we know it wasn't. It was in many ways it is fictionalized, though it's certainly based on her life. But her way of writing, her way of capturing a girl's life, a girl who's not particularly special, right? Or a family that's not particularly special. In fact, they're always on the brink of poverty, but she was so special to me and to all of us because somehow the way that book is narrated, we are with her. We're with little Laura Ingalls. So I was absolutely in love with that book. And I think that is one reason why I started to be interested in history.
Wonderful. And very lucky last question for you, Leah, just in terms of a piece of advice, a piece of good advice that you've been either given or that you've read that you might be willing to share with our listeners today. And this could be just in general, in just about life in general.
Get your butt in the chair. That is, right, the best piece of writing advice, but really work advice, certainly for writing, for research, whatever. It's not genius. It's not brilliance. None of that. It's just showing up every day, whether that's at your desk or whatever. I think that is so true.
Oh, I needed to hear that today because I did a lot of procrastinating yesterday, Leah. So thank you. I'm going to sit down today and I'm not going to move till I get done what I need to do. And the one final thing is our takeaway. So I ask all my guests for a takeaway. Sometimes people give books to read, about websites to have a look at, something that might deepen their understanding of 16th century, women in power, anything that we've discussed.
Yeah. So I actually just recently finally read Maggie O'Farrell's The Marriage Portrait, and I'm sure this is very familiar to a lot of your listeners. But I would say, Maggie O'Farrell gets at something that is so important about the 16th century, and that is the role of young women in these sort of systems of inheritance and how they're seen as dispensable. And what a violent and vulnerable situation that was for so many women, many of whom were murdered by their husbands. So, I think she does it so well. It's beautifully written. I loved it. And so if you want a fictional treatment of some of the same themes I'm dealing with in nonfiction, definitely go read that book.
What a fantastic takeaway. I actually listened to that one as well, and it was an incredible listen if you're looking for, again, another great book to accompany you on your walks. And just as a side note, have you read Hamnet, Leah?
Yes. Oh, yes.
How brilliant is that book? I finished that just thinking, how did she do that?
Yeah, well, again, right? Like just sort of sitting with this woman's grief, right? And she invites us or draws us in, and we're just sitting with this woman's grief. And I think that people who didn't like that book didn't quite understand maybe that's what
I didn't know
she was trying to do.
I mean, book. That's it was probably my favorite read of whatever year it came out. I can't remember, a couple of years ago, I think.
It was
brilliant.
It was great.
Leah, this has been such a lovely conversation and so lovely to meet you and speak with you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, it was such a pleasure to talk about all these things with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.